It looks like the recording is on. So welcome everyone to SQL Friday number 80. For me, it's noon. For Matt, it's early morning, and he worked late evening yesterday. So thank you so much for standing up early, despite the late work, Matt. Matt is going to talk about some failures, which I really love, because it's what, if you're a DBA, you made mistakes in your career, and Matt is going to share some of his, which will form, I think, some good advice for us all. Don't make the same mistakes Matt did. And for me, I know that people make mistakes. I just don't want them to make the same mistake twice. So, Matt, welcome. I'll let you introduce yourself and your experience and what the talk is going to be about.
Okay. All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen and tell me you're seeing my slides.
I see the presenter view.
That should work better now.
Yep, perfect.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so what this is, we're going to start on a happy note. It's actually something that I fixed eventually. All of these I fixed eventually. That one is probably more positive than the other three. But yeah, what I wanted to, I see a lot of talks where the speaker presents themselves, and often they are, like they're an expert in their field and they've never done anything bad, right? And they're telling you, they're going to spend 45 minutes, an hour, whatever, telling you all the wonderful things that they've done, and never any of the mistakes they've made, and how the latest and greatest thing is really cool and you should use it and all those sorts of things. I wanted to come at it from kind of an opposite angle and talk about some mistakes that I've made, and how not to do that. And I'll be curious for feedback on this. So this is a brand new talk, and like most sessions in the last 2 years, not only is it brand new, I've never given it to a room of people either. So this is kind of its first go round. I picked the stories in here because I think they represent some concepts that are transferable beyond the tech that we're going to talk about. We can get deeply techie here if we want. My intention is to not to, but I'm happy to field questions and all of that around these. But I do eagerly look forward to feedback on this, because I hope the stories I've picked kind of get across the points I'm trying to make. But if not, feel free to tell me. So here we are. So I broke it so you don't have to. There's definitely some HADR fails in here. I hope it's fun. We'll find out, right? So this is me. This is all the ways to find me online. I'm SQL at Speed everywhere: Twitter, LinkedIn, blog, GitHub, all that stuff. I was fortunate enough to have a book on Azure AI that came out last year. That's the picture you see there. So if you've come here and also kind of have a side interest in AI like I did, we think the book turned out well. I also get to play race cars once in a while. So that's, as you might guess, kind of how I've picked my handle is, I do like to make things go fast and not just code. A little bit more about me, and what I want to do is kind of draw your attention to the last line here. I run our local user group. Obviously, the notion of a local user group, whether here in the States or anywhere else, has been a bit fluid these past few years, because a lot of the meetings are still virtual. There may be a hybrid part, but you're going to hear me make this point a couple more times in this talk. Finding a community to help you, whether it's technically, or even whether it's just finding people who share your job role and kind of getting some support from them as you deal with things. It's been amazingly helpful to me. So however you plug in, whether you're speaking, whether you set up an event, you're moderating, whatever, I definitely recommend, if this is your first meeting or something like this, please don't make it your last. It will help you in a lot of ways you think it will, and some ways you haven't thought of yet. So thanks for being here, and thanks for spending roughly the next hour with us. So let's talk about what I broke. So this kind of breaks down into three main things. We're going to start with some tech stories, some real stuff that I broke. All of it, like I said, was eventually fixed, but there's a couple in here that were pretty silly when you look back on them. So I hope they help. And I do want this to be as interactive as I can. Unfortunately, Teams is not showing me the chat, so I'll probably just take a few breaks and ask if there are questions in there. And especially given the size of the group, I'm okay with people just unmuting to ask me stuff too. So if it's just an hour of me talking at this, that probably won't be the most exciting thing. So hopefully we can have some conversation as well. And like I said, I encourage feedback, whether it's during the session, after the session. I'll put my contact info up later, but I do kind of want this to be a two-way thing. So we're going to talk tech. We're going to talk about ways that I could have done better for my teams through the years. I've been fortunate where I have had the opportunity to lead some teams, and definitely looking back on that, there's some things that I could have done better. And then, what I want to wrap up with, and this is probably not the funniest part, but I think it's important to talk about, is the toll that being on call and running highly available environments can take personally too. I think that's often overlooked, and that is something I kind of wanted to work into this. So like I said, we can get as techie as you want. I hope this is a good blend of tech and not tech, but let's find out. Story time. Okay, here's the first thing that broke. And this one I'll preface by saying it was a design that predated me. Now, the way I'm going to portray it, it sounds like it was a fairly instant fix. It was not, but I was ultimately the one that fixed this. So what the story was is the state that I live in, we have about 190 school districts. So my state is broken up into a bunch of counties, and some of those counties have not only like a main school district, but an independent one as well, that's organized a little differently. So we could spend an hour talking about Kentucky schools. We're not going to. But so what's important to understand is these are basically like 190 kind of satellite offices that all maintained a SQL server that stored attendance and grading information for the schools. I won't name the vendor. I believe they've actually exited the educational business by now, maybe because they were putting up signs like this. But so their model was you had a SQL server basically at the state office. And that was, and this was actually running SQL Server 2000. So it is a few years ago, but not as long ago as one might think to be running that version. It was running on top of a Windows cluster. So 2 nodes. You had an active node, you had a passive node. It had a substantial amount of horsepower. To be honest, these databases weren't that big. And I, when I started there and I was basically hired to fix this, the setup seemed, it seemed like we had plenty of horsepower to do everything we needed, but we didn't. So what was happening was, despite the best efforts of the vendor and some other folks they had brought in to fix this, is this very expensive and honestly pretty well configured cluster was crashing all the time. Constant failovers, usually more than one a day. It made the system in many ways kind of unusable. And as you might imagine, things that are storing grades for all the kids in public schools in a state, there's a lot of reports you have to run off that, a lot of information that gets served off of that, a lot of decisions being made about quality of schools, quality of teachers, administrators, all that, and you couldn't get to it most of the time. So it was a big deal. So you may be wondering, what was the technical fix for this? because this was, they had spent the money to have a highly available setup. On paper, it sure looked that way, but it really struggled to stay running at all. So what the fix was, and that's kind of highlighted by the first bullet here, is it was scheduling the jobs that transferred the data back to the home office. So it wasn't, it was basically SQL Server replication that they were using. It was kind of a, I would say, lightly modified version of kind of standard jobs to send data back and forth. But the problem wasn't with the high availability setup at all. It was configured just as well as I thought. It had just as much horsepower as we thought it should have, and everything worked right. The fundamental issue is that they had set up all 190 of these servers to call home at exactly the same time. And that led us down a path of, there were some things that replication was struggling with because it was basically trying to do too many things at once, and that was leading to the service crashing. That was leading to the cluster failovers as well. So there was kind of a cascading series of failures. But long story short, there wasn't a technical fix. Now, what was interesting about this, even though this was schools, so it wasn't private sector, I've certainly worked in some private sector places where this was the case. The amount of paperwork and the number of meetings that I had to do to get this across, not only to the vendor, but the IT leadership across the districts and all of that, was substantial. So, what are our takeaways from this one? Number one, like the second bullet says, troubleshooting a high availability issue or what you think is one may not lead you to that setup itself. It may be something outside. Number two, when you work in a large environment, I've worked in large and small, be prepared for the number of times you're going to have to explain the same thing over and over again, and likely the amount of kind of bureaucratic red tape you're going to have to deal with to implement what would seem to be a simple fix. So from when I discovered this to when I was actually able to get the times moved around in such a way where the system ran normally as it was expected to, was almost 3 months. And you're probably sitting there saying like, well, but Matt, this is simple. You just said you changed the times and kind of scattered them and it was fine. That's all I did. But, don't, if you're in a large environment, don't shy away from that part of the job. I hate the term soft skills, but being patient with people and, explaining clearly and calmly the things you need to do and why is a useful skill, whether you're consulting, speaking, whatever. That I've certainly worked with people where, a lot of high availability setups can be complicated. The one I just talked about wasn't. The one I'm going to talk about next is. But, you've worked with people who, because they designed and implemented these, they kind of lorded that over you and really didn't want to explain how it worked and kind of look down their nose at anybody asking about it. That's not something that's going to pay off for you in the long run. Not that I've seen. Final takeaway here is fresh sets of eyes on a problem can be very helpful. There's nothing weak about asking for help. This particular scenario that, the state's hand was forced because nobody there had been able to get to the bottom of what was going on. But the lesson I hope you take away from that is, if you feel like you're beating your head against a wall and getting up and taking a walk doesn't help. If you're fortunate enough to be part of a team, whether you're leading them or not, it's okay to ask for help. That second set of eyes is going to approach a problem from a fresh angle. And that is likely to be pretty useful. They may not fix it, but they may get your mind pointed in a way where you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Let's go look at this. So before I get to the second story, any comments about that? Any thoughts? Any questions for me about replication in SQL Server 2000.
There's one question from Lars. Do you want me to read it, Lars, or do you want to say your question yourself? I don't know. You can just unmute if you like.
Mm-hmm.
He says, go ahead in the chat. So how did you discover the 190 schools calling home at once caused the service to crash? So now we go tech, I guess.
Yeah. So, and this kind of goes back to, yeah, even though it was a technical issue, it was basic troubleshooting. You know, what I started to realize as you're digging through the logs is that these failures often at least started around the same time every day. Now, there were some days where honestly it would just fail over and fail back, and candidly, we never really got to the bottom of why some days were worse than others. But yeah, it was. I started off just looking at the logs and be like, wow, you know, every day. I don't recall what the time was. I think it was like 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. You'd have the first failover, and you'd go look and you'd see like, oh, the service had shut down, so that had kicked into a failover. They also had some kind of, the Windows admins had done some scripting around health checks and stuff that was a little over aggressive as well. But yeah, I mean, it really started off from there. And, you know, once I got the first batch kind of staggered, we realized that the problem had already lessened. And, you know, we were able to demonstrate that with logs and then go on and end up staggering all of them over the course of, I think it was 4 or 5 hours. But yeah, I wish it was some tricky bit of, you know, SQL Server stuff that I did, but in the end, it really was just pouring through logs and trying to figure out like if there's any pattern, and there was.
Cool.
Okay, all right. So that one, well, like I said, we're going to start on a positive note. That was something that I didn't design, that I was able to fix after a while. This one was mostly my fault. So what happened is I used to lead a team that supported several always-on AGs, usually either 2, 3, or 4 node. I think by the time I left there, we were supporting about 100 servers spread across 25 to 30 groups. It was a government benefit redemption business, and particular to helping folks that are down on their luck eat healthy food. So, you know, if you're in the grocery store with the card from this thing, basically tax dollars are buying your food. But it's a 24/7, 365 thing, because you don't always know when people are going to go to the store, right? So, you know, we had to run a very highly available setup at substantial cost, which the states paid. But you know, this stuff couldn't go down, because likely what that meant is some mom in line was not getting formula for her baby or something like that. And as was pointed out to us by one of the state leaders once upon a time, he said, if you guys are bad at your job, babies starve. Little over dramatic, but there was a kernel of truth to it. So as all of these projects started, there was always kind of a process you had to go through. And as you might imagine, anything with a government program, there's a lot of oversight and process. A lot of people have to sign off on things to ensure that the project is going the way it's supposed to. One of these was a failover test. And then you would basically demonstrate that you could do a failover. You would fail over to your other data center. You would fail back within a few minutes and say, here, it works. And then later on, which is the next story, you would do one that was for 2 days. So not only, you know, you had to demonstrate you could run from 2 sites for a few minutes, and then you had to demonstrate basically that the system acted exactly the same at one site versus the other, so they would not know. This system, actually the very first version of it was actually written against SQL Server 2005. So we were using mirroring then. As it started to take off, you know, SQL Server 2012 had come out. And so, we were pretty early on the always on AG wagon. So what happened is this was basically our first AG, and we had certainly built up how cool these things were going to be, that you could run it one data center or the other, and all the manual stuff we had done with mirroring in version 1. A lot of that was going to be automated. This was going to be super cool. You could just pull the plug on one building and it would fail over to the other one. We had to do almost nothing. So we certainly did a good job building it up. So what happened was, and I think kind of one of the unique parts of the story is, it was our NetOps group that did the whole cluster setup. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't ask. I mean, I knew what a cluster was, but I was not a part of the process and didn't really ask to be a part of it. The head of that group actually used to help me with my race car, so we were very good friends, and it was no issue. It wasn't the classic like, well, I don't like to talk to the networking people because they're mean. Like he was my friend, so it was no issue if I'd sat down and said, hey, draw this out for me. What are we doing here? I just said, I need a cluster. Okay, done. And then I set up the AG around it. Off we went. So as you might imagine, like I said, a lot of oversight, a lot of eyes on this test. And we had built it up to be, we were pretty much going to pull the main network cable in the primary center. And everybody was going to watch it fail over to the backup, and it was going to be awesome. And they were all going to think that we were smart. As the last bullet says, we pulled the plug basically on building A, and it all died. Really embarrassing. There's a simple reason as to why it did. The quorum in the cluster was set up so that basically 3 of the 4 voting nodes were in building A. So when we pulled the plug and building A went away, cluster quorum couldn't be met with the sole node in the other building. Now you might be sitting here and saying like, well, Matt, that's not your fault. The networking people did it. It was their screw up. Sure. But what I want us to take away from here, I mean, this is just one example of it, but I've seen it over and over again during my years. When you're running a highly available environment, they are often complicated. There are always elements that probably don't belong to a single team. Even the smallest shop, if it's just you and you're running anything like an always on AG or something like that, odds are somebody has set up the networking bit, somebody else owns the Windows servers or something like that. It's been a long time since I've seen a shop where it was just one person doing all of that. And when you run these setups, you need to be aware of every element of what the setup is. It's, I feel like the days are long past where a DBA can kind of proudly say, well, I'm just a data person. I don't do any of that. I just make sure that the database is fast, and I read the logs and I make sure it's doing all its jobs and it's maintained right, but that's somebody else's job. This stuff is so intertwined with networking, and especially when you start talking about always on AGs, FCIs, things like that. You need to stick your nose into the other parts of this, and that's the mistake that I made, because to be honest, it was me. I was the show. I was the one doing failover and all of that. So it didn't matter to anybody else. What had that I didn't do those parts. Similar to when somebody says the database is down. They don't care if it's a networking thing or whatever. The DBAs often are kind of the voice of that whole setup, right? Well, if we're going to be that voice and guide, it's always our phone that rings first, and we're going to guide the fix, we need to understand the other elements under the covers here. And finally, even when it's your buddy that built the thing and your buddy is really smart, verify that we're all cool with what was built. and test it. We didn't test it either. We were, we just thought it was going to be easy. And I had egg on my face for sure. So, test, and don't let the first test be in front of a group of people who are giving you a lot of money to make stuff work right. Any questions or comments on that one?
There is a comment, shakes his fist at cluster quorum with the AGs.
Yes.
Yeah, true. I like that you can use file share in Azure as a witness nowadays. I don't think it was possible in 2012.
Not well, and that was, so we were running, I can't remember, I think it was Windows Server 2012, might have even been 2008 then. But you got dynamic quorum in Windows 2012 R2. And so a lot of this did end up kind of taking care of itself over the year. And that's why I point out there that we were adopting it kind of early. There were some parts of it that weren't maybe ready for prime time. But yeah, this stuff, it all works so much better now. But if we had all the bits that worked nicely, then I wouldn't have that story to share. So, but yeah, this stuff's not as hard as it used to be, which is very nice. And like I said, that's just kind of one example of something that, you don't have to be an expert in all the other components, but something like quorum or, voting note, like those are terms you should be familiar with. And it kind of goes for any setup. Like when you get away from the database layer, I always think like you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to give an hour talk on it, but you ought to be able to at least whiteboard the way the rest of it looks. And then, when any of it breaks, you're all going to be better off because everybody's going to understand a little more about the part that they didn't build.
Yeah, and so just make a drawing on a piece of paper to this is the setup we have, because then and you kind of have the clear line. This is building A, this is building B, this is building C.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds silly, but as soon as you visualize something, you might realize that, okay, what I'm about to do is a bad idea.
Had we done that here, we all would have looked up there, been like, wait, 3 of the nodes are in one place. One is in the other. This isn't going to hold up. But instead, it was in front of, like I said, a group of people who were giving us a lot of money to do this right. And that was uncomfortable. So I don't recommend that. Test first, make all your mistakes when there's not a whole bunch of people watching.
Yeah, that's a good advice. I'm starting to sweat just by the thought of it. So.
Well, all's well that ends well. It ended up fine because, one of the upshots of doing like public sector stuff is there are not a lot of deeply technical folks. So you could just kind of say, oh, we messed up part of the magic. And then like we realized what we had done the next time it worked fine. And they're just, ooh. So it wasn't too bad, but I was sweating bad because, I could give a whole talk just on that night. All right. So we talked about one thing I screwed up and why, and some lessons from that. Let's tackle another one. So this was a 4-node always on group. And remember I mentioned that these projects all kind of follow the same pattern. And so what that pattern was is, there's some milestones you'd have to meet. You do that first failover test that I was just talking about. The first one we ever did, we messed up in a really embarrassing way. As the project went on, you would pass other milestones, and you would eventually have to schedule a 2-day failover test. And that was to prove to the federal agency that oversees it, to the state that's paying you for this, that the system can work elsewhere for 2 days. So let's say we were to have, a storm or an earthquake or something like that, primary data centers offline, didn't matter. That was the theory. And this is for real. So it's called a failover test, but the system is live when this happens. It's early on, so it's not processing probably transactions from every county in that state. But it is a live system. at that point in time, because you've already passed the failover test to show that you can do this. And at some point between that and this one, the system does go live. So we, as you might guess, and this is probably a story that's going to be familiar to most, it was oftentimes quicker for the DBAs to implement certain things than the dev team. So, and each state would kind of have customized processes about how the money flowed. And when they would make the transfer to the bank for all the grocery transactions that had happened the previous day or week or however they were set up. This particular state, they did it daily. And they requested something that hadn't been in the system, which was basically it was a query that would send an email to them and said this number of transactions for this happened, this number for that, and the sum total of all those was X $100,000. And that the receipt of that email by some of the financial folks at the state kicked off the process of the transfer to the bank of the money that was spent. It was important. But again, it landed in me and my team's lap because, as even agile dev teams do, they're like, oh, well, yeah, we'll do it, but it's going to be 3 months. And, the state was like, well, we need it now. It's like, well, if you need it now, it's going to get done this way. So we had this agent job that did it. They were pleased with it. It worked every day, ran on schedule, all good. Failover test happens. Initially goes great. We go to bed like the failover was clean, everything's running, system's right back up, SQL Server's happy, people are buying stuff, awesome. My phone rings fairly early the next morning, at a high volume. The report didn't fire, and people at the state are losing their mind about this. So I'm sitting there, I was like, well, failover worked just fine. Like, why did the report not send? It always works. The report didn't send for a very simple reason. None of the replicas had the job. And so again, this isn't particular to an agent job, but let's talk about some takeaways from this. Anything that you've kind of hung off the edge of a system, when you're talking about highly available stuff, make sure it makes the trip with you. It's a common thing. It's certainly true where I am now. Every consulting customer I had, I would say this was probably true for them. There are a lot of things in agent jobs or that the DBAs own that they own because it was simpler for them to do it. Those aren't always documented very well. They aren't always checked in the source. There's likely good source control for your app code and probably for the database code in your app. But for things like agent jobs and stuff like that, there may or may not be, right? And so that's, not only should you ensure that if you're in a highly available environment that all these kind of ancillary things exist everywhere you can fail over to, but it's also a good thing to think about documenting these things, checking them in the source, things like that. So let's go through these tips. Make sure all of your processes fail over with you. So, again, that could be an agent job. It could be anything somewhat external to the system that the DBAs are over. It might be scripted Windows jobs. It might be PowerShell scripts that are set to run on that server at a certain time doing something. Document all those. During your failover test those. It will save you from an angry phone call. Go over and over them. So one thing I always like to do, and to be honest, it's not practical in every environment, but it should be, is schedule a time for these tests to happen and make sure that it's rotating through the team who leads that test if you have a team. That way, when something goes wrong, it's fairly calm because everybody who's responsible for it has already done a failover. They understand what to check. They understand what should happen when. It's not a big deal. It's not panic stations, right? Third point like it says there, DBA tools is awesome. I didn't know about it then. I had not, I had never been to a past summit. I knew what a SQL Saturday was. I had never been. And so I mentioned at the start, you're going to hear me say this a couple times, and this is true. Like, community support is an awesome thing, whether it's for yourself personally or your code. DBA tools is a lifesaver, even if PowerShell is scary for you, and I am by no means a whiz at it at all. It makes so many things so much easier that, if it, please look into it. No joke, for basically anything that you are on a server to do, there is probably a commandlet out there that does part or all of it. Particular to this story here, copy DBA login and copy DBA agent job would have helped. Because I have kind of a sub story to this is the next failover test we had. I still didn't know what DBA tools was, though it kind of led to this. But I made sure I copied all the jobs, because last time I'd forgotten the jobs, right? I didn't copy the logins, so the job couldn't work. So make sure those go hand in hand. That's why I say, like, every ancillary process thoroughly tested, because had I thoroughly tested it rather than just manually reviewed the jobs and said, oh, it's there, I would have known that I forgot the logins as well. Now, this story is from a few years back, so Azure Data Studio was not a thing. But if we're talking about ways to automate things, take the manual thing out of it, where it's not the best process to have me basically pointing my finger at the screen, making sure all the jobs are there. You could automate things with scripting, and also Azure Data Studio notebooks. If you don't know about them, they are really cool. And there's a lot of investment from Microsoft in that team, and in what they're doing with that tool. It's worth a look, because one thing, and I actually used to give a whole session on these and how DBAs, I think, should use them more. What you're able to do with a notebook is you can put everything in line. So you have all your script cells, and you can also have images, text, and things like that. So you can have a run book that is documented with text, screenshots, all that. So when we start, it's not uncommon when you're supporting highly available stuff that you may have an overnight support partner that's offshore or onshore or something like that. But a lot of companies choose to do that rather than try to, hire somebody to work third shift. The place that we used, we would exchange Word documents back and forth, and there was a very manual process that we had to follow, that they also had to follow, to cut and paste screenshots into the Word document to prove to us that certain maintenance had happened, and was cumbersome, to say the least. Notebooks get all of that out of there. So if PowerShell's a little scary for you, but you're like, well, there is some stuff that we run, it would be nice to have somewhere where I could check in the source control and it's got the instructions right there, so I can just hand it off to a junior person on the team. Notebooks is where it's at. Well worth a look. And like I said, I could talk for an hour about those, because I have. Long story short, the takeaway from all of this is manual processes are no good. The more you automate, the fewer opportunities to screw things up you will find. Because as you've written the script and you've tested the script and then scheduled it, or a notebook which can be scheduled to run in an agent job straight from ADS, actually. You've taken the human element, the failure bit, largely out of it. And it also frees you up to do more stuff that's fun, like performance tuning and things like that. We don't want to be manually reviewing job lists and manually making sure that things have happened. We should script it once, schedule it, automate it, and go do fun stuff. Any questions or comments about that one?
You have David, who is writing DBA tools, exclamation mark, and then another one. And Gabriel says notebooks rock. And I mean, especially the first comment, DBA tools, there are things that I do on a daily basis. I don't know how I did them before. I probably did somehow, but it took more time and I made more mistakes, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah. Well, and it's, and when we wrap up, I'll talk about just, how some of this kind of wore me down over the years. But when you're worn down, you make a lot of mistakes. And if you take, if you remove the need for you to work when you're tired, you're going to screw less things up. So,
a question here from Max. What about MSX TSX for jobs?
I have used it. I'm not particularly fond of it, but it's fine, I think. Well, you know what? Let me revise that. I think any way you're comfortable automating stuff to a certain extent is fine, because the whole point of this story is to automate everything you can, because then you're thinking through all of these processes with a clear mind. And in theory, you're then writing the script with that clear mind. You're documenting it when you're not under the gun. So yeah, I actually shouldn't I may regret phrasing it like this, but there's almost no wrong way to automate stuff. I'm sure there is a wrong way, but anything you're doing to remove your ability to break stuff from the process is a good thing. Because I am pretty good at breaking stuff, as you've noticed.
Gabrielle is asking, how do you schedule notebooks?
So that I don't have the slides open right now. I could actually pull some slides out of my presentation to go over that. Long story short, when you download the SQL agent extension, which I think Microsoft has actually bundled into an extension that does maybe 2 or 3 other things as well. So extensions in Azure Data Studio, it's almost like downloading an app for your phone, kind of. Like it extends the capabilities of ADS into something else. And so Microsoft wrote an agent extension, and that gives you the opportunity to do several things, including visualize job runtimes and all that stuff, which is really cool. But there is a tab under that basically you schedule the notebook to execute as a job from there, and you say run against this server, this database, store and log your results wherever. So yeah, feel free to email me. My contact info will come up at the end, that I can pull those slides out. It'll kind of make sense with a screenshot. I don't have ADS open. But yeah, it's really easy, and it works really well. Yeah, that wasn't originally in there. Like I gave several versions of that talk as ADS kind of evolved, and when they introduced that, it had always been a gap, because people were like, oh, these are really cool. What's an easy way to schedule it? And I was like, well, there isn't one. But once they added that, it's really, really nice.
Do we have time for another question from Max?
Sure.
You tried to put MSDB as an SSDT project to get the jobs documented in source control.
That's interesting. Yeah, that kind of goes back to my point. Anything you can do to automate, anything you can do to document is good. I've never thought of doing it like that. Yeah, that would be fun to play with.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. All right. So the last story about breaking stuff, and then we'll talk people stuff a bit. So this is not actually something I broke. This was a consulting customer, the company that I used to work for before I have the role that I have now. We had put together with Microsoft basically a plan. They were migrating one of their core business apps to the cloud. But the executive we were dealing with and I think we probably all know this type of person. He was pretty sure that we were working in Angle, and that, you know, we didn't have his best interests at heart. We're just trying to sell Azure stuff, right? And certainly Microsoft is pretty interested in that. But as a consulting partner, we wanted to do right by them because we wanted to be a partner with them for a long time. So certainly was not working any sort of an angle, but that guy just thought we were, you know, trying to hit a bonus goal or something like that. Had nothing to do with that at all. So like I said, they chose to migrate a core business app to the cloud, but as the second bullet notes, to save every dollar possible. So pinching pennies to the extreme, which, as a general recommendation, I would say if you're wanting to pinch pennies migrating to the cloud, you should probably wait, because there you do need some budget flexibility to do things right, at least up front. But this isn't a cloud talk. So what happened was we put together you know, kind of a diagram and price list of like, here's everything you should get. Here are kind of the add-ons you should get. You know, because of the nature of their business, the uptime out of Azure SQL they needed, we recommended having like zone redundancy set up, so failure in one data center didn't take them down. You basically what that means is you were replicating all of your data to several data centers in the same region. So if data center 1 in US East falls over, you're going to live on in data center 2, let's say. But and then there was some stuff, and we won't get too far into this, but there's some stuff in the web and app tier as well that we recommended redundancy and VMs and all that, but it didn't come free. It did cost money because you're replicating things to other places. You're taking up resource in those other places. So yeah, it cost more. Like I said, he thought we were working in Angle, and he declined he basically picked the core, but, you know, said like, well, I've done my research, and, you know, clouds don't break. Like they you know, they have all this stuff built in. You guys are just trying to sell add-ons that I don't need. You may remember, in fact, there's been more than one over the years. There was an Azure Active Directory outage, and this is a couple years ago now. But basically authentication was broken. So the services were up. If you went to the Azure status page, there's green check marks everywhere. You couldn't sign into anything. So for their purposes, it was down. Had he taken our advice, he would have been fine. He wasn't. So, you know, what are some takeaways from this? Unfortunately, it looks like that's interesting. So one of the slides I had disappeared. So the takeaway slide that after this I will have to find later, but it is not here. So the takeaways from this are, and this extends whether it's consultants, employees, whatever. When you're paying people for their advice, take it. It's always been frustrating for me because I was a DBA for a long time, consulted for 7 years, and I'm now kind of back in a DBA role and doing some other data things too. It was always frustrating for me to walk in as a consultant and have my word trusted over oftentimes the very good people that were already there. And, you know, not every time, because obviously a lot of times as a consultant, you're going in to fix something because the people there can't, or there aren't enough of them. But many times I would be brought in and they would say, you know, analyze this and tell us how the setup should be. And we would do it and look at it. And they, you know, what would come back to us was some version of, well, my lead DBA or whatever already said that. Incredibly frustrating. So if you're paying people for their advice, take it. And be aware, this isn't a cloud talk, but I didn't feel like I could have a high availability session without talking about this. Clouds can break. They're not magic, like the title of the slide says. There are redundancy problems you have different tools to solve slightly different issues. A lot of the stories I've told leading up to this, clusters not configured right, things like that. In the cloud, that's not going to happen because a lot of that stuff's managed for you. But what can still happen is data centers can go offline. And if that's a key part of your business, you're going to want redundancy built in and not just trust whatever cloud provider you're using to not break. There are whole sessions that I have done and more that I could do about different ways to design for HA and in the cloud. The point of this one is basically don't forget about it. Don't just read the marketing stuff and say, well, 4 nines is probably good enough for me. Sure, it may cost you something, and you have to kind of balance those, right? Is it is it worth the extra money to have that extra layer of safety built in? Depending on your business, your app, whatever, it may not be, and that's okay. But if it is, if you need that high availability, design for it, and just understand that in the cloud, basically the same things can present themselves in different ways, and we have some different tools to use them. Any questions or comments about that? And then we'll wrap up with a couple quick things about broken people.
Nothing in the chat, but if I can add something, when if it's AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, it doesn't matter. The high availability options or disaster recovery options, they're often just a checkbox.
Yes.
So, but still, it's a cost tied to it, of course. But it's very easy to set it up, and I really agree with one of your initial points that there might be an upfront cost before you decide that, okay, I can live with some less redundancy, but just start with something that is, where you have the redundancy and you have the high availability and so on, and then look what the cost will be for that. And migrating to Azure is not going to be the driver for that. Shouldn't be saving money on infrastructure, but just free up time to do more important things than set up the processes for it.
Yeah. Well, and also keep in mind, even the financially backed SLAs for some of the higher tiers, whether it's Azure, Amazon, whatever, because this guy, was very kind of focused on that too. He's like, well, Microsoft's going to cut me a check if they're down. And sure, they did, but it doesn't replace the business you lost because you were down for 8 hours. Like, they're going to credit you back a day of Azure, a day of that service. But that doesn't replace every customer who went into your app and couldn't do anything. And so they didn't buy a thing, which is a point we had tried to make to him. Didn't get through, but I suspect when he looked back on that, he realized we were right, and I hope went back and bought more stuff. So, okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we've talked tech for almost an hour here, but we shouldn't walk away from this just having it focused on tech. The people that run these environments are people. It's sure we can automate a lot, and even cool cloud stuff manages a lot of stuff by itself, but you still have people running it, and those people need a few things. And I've certainly run teams into the ground, and as we'll see in a couple slides, myself too, by not doing the things that I'm going to say on this slide. So first things first, train your team. Like we've said over and over again, some of these environments, some of these setups, always on AGs, FCIs, things like that, very complicated. Not everybody has the same level of comfort working on those. Your junior folks may have never seen them. Make sure everybody has the training they need to support what you have. If you have the coolest HADR solution in the world, and you can give an hour-long session about how amazing it is and how smart you are, if you go on vacation and nobody else knows how to work on it, it's not likely to be highly available. If there's a problem and you're not there, they likely are going to make things worse trying to fix it. So make sure your team is trained. There's a lot of resources out there. I mean, not that there's been a lot of positives over the last 2 years, but the availability of free training online, things like this, conferences, all that. There's a lot of free things you can get. I think long past are the days where you had to send somebody off to a classroom for 5 days to learn how to run stuff. There's a lot of things online available for no cost or very modest costs that you're going to be able to get somebody ramped up. Take advantage of those. Practice the processes you have. I'll say it over and over again. After the talk is over, I'll say it to my team a few more times. This is critical. I wasn't always good about that. As you saw, there were some things that you were probably hearing me tell the story and be like, why didn't you test that? A great point. I should have. I know that. I have since, but it's part of the reason I enjoyed building this session, because this stuff's important. When there's an outage and you're able to handle it calmly because you know everything you're supposed to do. Parts of it are automated. The part that you have to do, well, it's A, going to get fixed a lot faster, and B, going to have less of an impact on yourself too. The third thing, if you're leading a team, or you have the ear of your team lead, do not silo the group. Like I said, when we're running complicated HA setups, we're long past the days where we can ignore the network people, ignore the server people, ignore the storage people. We're all in this together with a lot of these setups. And the reality is, when the database is down, nobody cares what layer it is. Our team or you yourself is going to own that. So we need to make sure that we are familiar with all the other bits and we build bridges to those other teams and that we get along pretty well, because we're going to need their help to fix a lot of this stuff too. We're not on an island anymore. And the cloud makes that even more true, because so much of what can go wrong getting to the cloud, to be honest, is networking stuff. So it's still going to be the database is down because people can't get to it. But you're going to have to help your networking team identify what happened, and likely they're going to be part of the fix. Last but not least, people are not robots. Be cognizant of that. If you're in any sort of a position of authority at all, make sure you're managing the team's workload, especially in an environment like this, especially in the job market that we have now. People will leave if you're not taking care of them. You can do everything that we've talked about here. Make sure that they're properly trained, they have the time to practice this stuff, they feel comfortable what they're doing, but also look out for them. Don't overburden them. Don't be afraid to push back on certain things or the timing of certain things, and make sure you're talking. I'm not in an office with any of my team, but I do try to kind of check in on everybody every day just to see how things are going, and make sure you get to know them. It's challenging because I work with some people I have never met outside of Zoom, but build whatever relationship that medium allows you to, and try to take care of your folks if they're running environments like this, because the kind of mental burden of, if I mess up, the company loses money or something like that, it's not something we talk about a lot, but it really is. It can be a real drag against kind of everything else you're doing, because that's always in the back of your mind. And that kind of brings me to the last thing. So you're not highly available. You're one person. Proper procedures are important. Again, that's for personal comfort, whether you find yourself a very organized person or not. Documenting all this stuff, having it where you can just grab it and go, whether it's however you've done it, scripting, notebooks, whatever, that's mentally going to help you, because you're not going to feel like you're flailing for an answer. Good partners. So I've left that a bit vague. In my experience, it often was kind of that third-party support whether it was offshore, onshore, nearshoring, whatever the buzzword is. A small team can't be on call all the time. I've been that where, two of us were on call, both of us quit because it wasn't a sustainable thing. An on-call rotation where you're on call 26 weeks a year is no good. And especially in this job market, like I said, people will leave that and find something where they don't have it. So find good support partners to help, whether that's outside consultants or overnight maintenance places like Datavale, Navisite. Take advantage of those, advocate for those. That third bullet, take up for yourself and your team. It might be something like that. It might be, hey, we need some time off. Hey, this long-term project, we need a break. We need to pause things for a week because we're running people into the ground, and tired people screw things up. We've heard how I have, and I'm not alone in that, I don't think. Superhero complex is not a healthy thing. I think a lot of us that do this and support environments like this, part of what we enjoy is kind of that rush. Like, well, I understand this complex environment. I designed it. I built it. I know how to fix it. And it's a nice feeling when something goes wrong and you've done magic, right? That can wear on you too. And it gets back to training everybody, training your team, creating a team if you don't have one. Because always riding to the rescue on this stuff takes a mental toll on you that you're not aware of. When I left my on-call role to get into consulting, I didn't realize how bad I felt. I was waking up probably 2 or 3 times a week around 3 a.m. to do maintenance or emergency on-call stuff, and I didn't realize how dragged, how much damage I had done to myself until I got out of that. And so this slide is basically about that. Take care of yourself. Don't run yourself down. And there are opportunities. Like I said, this job market is really good for folks that do what we do. There are opportunities to leave a role that you're not happy in. Last but not least, and this will be the last time I say this because it's the last slide, find community support where you can. So we talked about DBA tools and things like that, code that people have written that can help us. The same goes for personal stuff as well. There is a community out there that does what we do, that's pretty well structured online, I would say. So if you find yourself needing maybe not technical support as much as personal stuff, getting involved in events, organizations, things like that can be really helpful that way too, because it's people that are going to understand what you're going through, that have done the on-call thing and all that. And there's an example actually today. It's at US time. I think it starts mid-morning, like 10 a.m. So probably about 3 hours from now, I think. The Data Platform Women in Tech group does, I think this is the second edition of their mental health and wellness day. And it's basically a series of talks. I think there's a lot of lightning talks. I don't think there's a lot of long sessions. But it's people that do what we do, sharing experiences like that. And there's not a lot of tech in it, but it's very personal. So if you're if you're finding yourself in need of something like that, their lineup is awesome. There's a lot of helpful things in there. I know I'll drop in on some of it, and that's just kind of one example of how we can all help each other. With that, I am all through. Like I said, these are all the ways to find me. Definitely want any feedback you've got on the session at all. The joke I always use is, if you think it was really good, tweet about it. If you think it was bad, don't tell anybody else, but email me so I can fix it. And I'm all done. So thank you very much for having me and hanging out over lunch, I guess.
Thank you, Matt, for getting up early for us to share your experience and some good stories and some good advice.